Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer had a very shiny nose, and if you ever saw it, you would even say it glows. This is the story of Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer, a modern fable. Well, as you know, Rudolph was born with a shiny red nose, and all of his fellow reindeer thought he looked strange and weird, so they, just like people will do, picked on him and excluded him from all of their activities, and he was pretty much cast out and a dreg of reindeer society. Well, as you also know, one particular Christmas Eve was incredibly foggy, and Santa Claus needed to get his sleigh out and about and get the presents delivered, but he couldn't see through all the pea soup fog. And it dawned on him that the outcast loser, Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer with his shining beacon of a nose, would perhaps serve to get him through the fog. So he got him, and he used him, and it worked out perfectly. And afterwards, for a brief period of time, Rudolph was treated as a rightful member of society. But soon thereafter, free trade came to the North Pole, and Santa realized that he could get really cheap halogen lamps for the sleigh from China. So he did. And Rudolph was no longer needed, so he was fired. Now, everything went okay for a short period of time thereafter, because after all, Rudolph had his friend, the elf, and he had his girlfriend, a very pretty young doe. And so things seemed to be okay, because Rudolph got unemployment insurance, and he was doing okay, scraping by, just barely. But soon after free trade arrived, so did global warming. And because reindeer were extremely inefficient and created so much carbon in their eating and their living, Santa decided to sell off the reindeer and go with a jet-assisted takeoff for his sleigh. Sure, there's some carbon emissions there, but a lot less than is required for caring for all those reindeer. So all the reindeer were put out of work, and Santa went about his business using his new jet-assisted takeoff sleigh. Now, after the free trade and the climate change came to the North Pole, soon also healthcare reform came. Now this put Rudolph in a bit of a dilemma, because he had a pre-existing condition, a genetic deformity, which gave him his shining beacon of a nose. And in order to qualify for coverage under the new healthcare reform being planned for the North Pole, he had to get sterilized, because they did not want to have any genetic deformities come through. That would be the only way he could qualify for health insurance coverage. So Rudolph was sterilized, and he couldn't have any children with his beautiful young doe, and she soon left him. Now most of the other reindeers were living in pretty much the same situation as Rudolph, a little bit luckier perhaps, because they weren't suffering from a genetic deformity, and they were not forced to get sterilized. However, living on their own like they were, they didn't have any prospects for work, so most of them ended up on Skid Row. And eventually all of them had to go back to the wild and try to forage for themselves, where most of them were shot by poachers who didn't have anything to eat because of the food safety guidelines that were just passed in the North Pole. Meanwhile, Rudolph, just barely struggling by, sterilized as he was, a freak of nature as he was, living, as it were, from cave to cave, and hiding out from the starving Eskimos who were trying to abide by the new regulations for food safety. Just one day, after visiting Yukon Cornelius, who by then was put into a mental asylum because he just snapped, decided that life wasn't worth living anymore after the free trade, the healthcare reform, the food safety guidelines, and the loss of all of his companions, and he jumped off that giant crevasse where the Bumble lived and crashed onto the rocks and died. The end.